Hey, this is Josh Brahm, and I wanted to tell you about the episode that we're putting out today. When we first surveyed our audience, asking what kinds of things they would be most interested in hearing on this podcast, like we had 4 or 5 options, and almost half of the people who took the survey checked all of the boxes. But because not everyone did, some of the options were more popular than others. And the most popular option that we asked people if they were interested in were live speech audio and Q&A audio. We haven't posted any speech audio or Q&A audio since we started the podcast a few months ago, simply because we didn't get recordings of a lot of the talks that we did while we were traveling around this spring. But the Atlanta Homeschool Conference that I spoke at recently is an exception, where I gave 2 sessions, and I do have recordings of both of those talks. So today, instead of an audio blog, I'm putting out the entire speech that I gave in the first session, as well as the Q&A audio after it. Later on, I'll release the Q&A from the second session that I gave. I won't release the entire speech just because it's a speech that I've given multiple times before, and if you follow our work or watch our speeches, then you've seen basically that talk before, and it's only the Q&A section at the end that would be unique. Another thing that we'll be releasing at some point in the not-so-distant future are some Q&A audios that I've recorded recently here in the studio while video conferencing with groups who have taken our course and are getting ready to go and do outreach, and I've done some Q&A with them. I don't know how much we're going to be doing that. This is sort of a couple of test cases that I'm doing. I'm thinking of maybe setting up like a premium level of the course where if someone pays extra, they can get access to Tim or I for an hour or two to do Q&A after they take the course. At some point, I might survey our audience and see how much interest there is in that. So anyway, the fact that I did that a few times recently is not a guarantee that I'm going to do that for all of the groups who are taking the course. I don't think we could pull that off. There's too many. But I did kind of want to test that, make sure that we've got the equipment to be able to record that well and do that. And so anyway, I'll be releasing those Q&A audios at some point in the future as well. So on weeks when we have something like that, something that's longer to release, we'll just skip the audio blog for that Thursday, release the speech audio, and then go back to the audio blog in the next week. So without further ado, here is the speech that I gave in my first session at a recent homeschool conference in Atlanta. Well, it's an honor to be here. I was homeschooled from kindergarten through 12th grade. And so I'm excited to be here with you guys, finally getting to kind of share what I've been learning. I went straight from homeschooling into pro-life ministry, and I've been full-time in pro-life ministry since I was 18. But I remember when we had our homeschool graduation, you know, we all got to speak. It wasn't just the valedictorian, because we got to do whatever we wanted. I got to speak. I remember, like, kind of the main point that I made was, like, I feel like at a homeschool graduation, it's not as much about celebrating what the students have accomplished. It's about celebrating what the parents have accomplished. So I just want to say, like, the sacrifices that you are all making, I think, are huge and to be celebrated. And I just feel honored to be kind of sharing with you some of the things that we've been learning in this ministry that I started 3 years ago. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of background on myself and kind of what we do, just kind of to lay a quick foundation. And then the 2 things I want to talk about is what we have been learning in the last few years about the state of college campuses as it relates to pro-life conservative students. And I'll transition to some of the things I think would be really, really good for them to learn before they get there, because college professors aren't just interested in converting Christians to atheists. There are also a lot of professors that are interested in converting conservatives to liberals, pro-lifers to pro-choice people. But as a quick just kind of background on me, I knew I was going to be doing pro-life speaking when I was 11 years old. So I have a strange story. I grew up in Sacramento, California, and we went to a very, very pro-family, pro-homeschool, pro-life church. And when I was 11, my dad took me with a group of guys from our church to the local abortion clinic in downtown Sacramento to pray. But what was interesting was no one had told me what abortion was first. And so I was pretty bored. Like, I was like, I don't understand what we're talking about. Like, we're in front of this weird brick building in downtown Sacramento, or there's a street right here, there's a park across the street, and I'm just like, what are we doing? What are we talking about? I didn't understand the prayers. But I asked my parents that day, like, what's that all about? And they told me what abortion was. And I remember having 3 distinct emotions. First emotion that I felt was surprise.
it was a very pro-family, pro-homeschool church, and I was a bit, and again, I'm not saying this in a negative way, but I was kind of sheltered from what was going on in the world. And so this was the first time that my cultural bubble got pierced. The first time that I had to kind of confront real sin in a very real way. So I was really surprised, not that it was legal so much, but it was like that they would want to do that. I'm in a church where people have 8, 9, 10, 11 kids. It's not weird. And it's just like, what? So I was surprised. The second thing was I felt deeply sad. Not angry so much as just deeply sad. And then I just had this growing sense, I think probably because there's a homeschool kid, of I'm guessing I'm going to have to stop that. So I was going to end abortion. That was kind of my plan. And so I started reading books and listening to tapes from this guy who was kind of the first pro-life apologist, a guy named Scott Klusendorf, and listen to his tapes over and over and over and memorize his arguments, memorize his jokes. And like when people would ask me, what do you want to be when I grow up? I wasn't going to be a firefighter. I wasn't going to be an astronaut. I wanted to be a pro-life speaker when I grew up. So I knew 22 years ago what I was going to be doing, and from 18 years old, this is what I've been doing full-time. Turned down a professional music career to do this because there's a lot of great musicians and great worship leaders out there. There's not that many great young pro-life speaker guys. And so I just felt a very kind of distinct calling on my life from a really young age. And I'm really glad for that because I am the luckiest guy in the world. I am doing full-time. I am paid to do what God wired me to do. How cool is that? I love this. This is my favorite thing to do. So glad you're here. And so, but it was only, I'm going to skip like a lot of what I did between 18 and 3 years ago, just for the sake of time, and just say 3 years ago, I had been doing this for about 12 years. I had come to have a very distinct vision for what I want to see pro-life dialogue be. And so my brother and I, this might be it's a real quick tangent, but encouraging, if you have kids who don't get along, I was going to try to tell you, hopefully encourage you a little bit. I didn't get along with my brother when we were growing up. I was the oldest of 4, and my brother was a couple years younger than me. And we were in the same bedroom like until I was 18. And we just didn't get along very well. I was a very good older brother. He wasn't a very good younger brother. And so just like we butted heads a lot. And I don't know if you're dealing with this right now, but it's just sibling rivalry, stupid stuff. And so when I turned 18, luckily, or a little bit after that, God did, I think, what parents usually do when their kids aren't getting along. He separated us by like 2,000 miles. So Tim went to Biola to get a philosophy degree, and I went full-time into pro-life work. And several years later, we grew this mutual respect for each other. I came to believe that he was one of the smartest people in the movement because he was seeing problems philosophically that the other smart guys in the pro-life movement weren't. So I was like, wow, this is awesome. And so like just my feelings about him were changing. His feelings were about me were changing. I just came to respect my speaking skills and leadership things and whatever. And eventually we came together to work on a book 3 years ago. We spent about a week working on a book project together. But ultimately what happened, instead of writing a book, we did the Equal Rights Institute because we've got a very similar vision for what we want to see pro-life dialogue be. One of our really high values is we want to be innovative and flexible with our training material. What we really care about is what works, what actually persuades pro-choice people. We want to see pro-choice people change their minds. And so it's not just what arguments are true. There are lots of true pro-life arguments, like arguments that are, logically valid. The conclusion follows from the premises. There's no fallacies. But not all true arguments are equally persuasive to today's pro-choice college students. So we're really interested in what actually connects with people. What gets around the wall? Like everyone's got a wall. Like when I walk into a pro-choice person on a college campus, there is a wall between us. Because the more I talk to people, the more amazed I am at the ability of the human being to believe what it wants to believe. I think there are a lot of pro-choice people, not all, but I think a lot of pro-choice people are pro-choice primarily because they want to be. Because their lifestyle doesn't work unless they're pro-choice. And so they've told themselves, and we all do this too, like this is not just a pro-choice problem, but like they've told themselves whatever they had to tell themselves for years a lot of times to be pro-choice. It's not a baby, it's not a baby, it's not a baby. Her body, her choice, her body, her choice. So pro-lifers are mean, pro-lifers are mean. Like whatever they had to say, and they've built up kind of this psychological wall. And we're always trying to figure out, how do we get around that wall? What kinds of dialogue techniques and what kinds of arguments are going to work given that they've already kind of made up their mind on this issue a lot of times. And so when we go on a college campus, that's our lab. We love doing R&D. We love trying new things. I've got a list right now of the things that I want to try the next time we do an outreach. I can't wait. Every time we go on a campus, we've got 2 or 3 things we want to just test. And sometimes we test things that miserably fail. And then sometimes we try things that are like, ooh, that worked really well. And then we'll try it some more. And as we're learning what works, we can communicate that to the people who follow us. I basically want to see the entire pro-life movement there's we have a mission statement. We train pro-life advocates to think clearly, reason honestly, and argue persuasively. It's kind of an apologetic sounding mission statement. The heart behind that mission statement, though, that we've purposely not put on the website because I want people to get to know us a bit before we get to kind of our religious views. But the heart behind this is I want to see the pro-life movement become more like Jesus. So what would it look like if Jesus talked to a pro-choice person? What would his body language be like? What kinds of questions would he ask? What kinds of questions would he not ask? And what would it sound like when he made arguments that are grounded in truth, not holding back from arguing? But what would it sound like when he made those arguments, but it's spoken with gentleness and love and grace? What would that look like? I want to help the movement as a whole get closer to that target. And so to do that, we're doing speaking and writing, and we've got a course now I'll talk about a little bit at the end. And a lot of outreach to try to figure out what's working with today's college students. Because people change, culture changes. So between my brother and I alone, we've had about 3,000 conversations with pro-choice people. So a lot of where our thinking and conclusions come from is a lot of experience with very different kinds of people. And I'll tell you, pro-choice college students today think, generally speaking, pretty differently than they did just 5 years ago. So culture changes, and that's why we want to be innovative with our training material, because what worked 5 years ago doesn't always work now, given the different ways kind of psychologically this current culture is thinking. And that will change again. So we're always on campus trying to find out what works, what doesn't work. So that's a bit about us. Let me talk to you a little bit about what's going on college campuses. Before I do that, I'm going to pass around an iPad. This is the easiest way for me to get, if you're interested in getting emails from us, mainly we just send emails when we put out a new article. We almost never ask for money in emails. It's not one of those nonprofits that sends you an email every other day, please give us money. It's not that kind of thing. I hate that. But if you're interested in, as we kind of publish things that we're learning or events we're doing, if you're interested in that, you can add yourself to this. I do this because I've given up on trying to read people's handwriting. And you type it yourself on my iPad, and I'll just import it into my thing. We never sell, never spam, very, very concerned about privacy. If you don't want any emails from us, then just pass it along. Here's what we're learning about college campuses. You've probably seen some of the stories of leftists censoring conservative free speech lately on college campuses. What rarely makes the news, though, is what happens inside the classrooms. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about what we're hearing, because we work with college students more than anyone else. We work with high school students too, but especially we do outreaches on college campuses for the most part. So we work with college students, the active pro-life college students all across the country all the time. And so we hear a lot of things about what's going on. Here's the good news. It's not as bad as God's not dead. The level of I will flunk you if you don't change your beliefs, I have not yet heard a story that is that bad. So I don't want you concerned about it sort of like an urban legend. I do want you concerned about the reality, though, which is not that much worse. Or that much better, I should say. Here's what we're hearing actually goes on. I'm going to read you a story that someone that I know sent me just a week ago. So this is from Rachel Crawford, who's a brilliant young philosopher. She's actually coming on our staff later on this year after she raises her support. She's fantastic. But she told us a story recently about something that happened in her biology class. So I just learned this about her recently. And this is kind of a good example of what kinds of things that we hear about, what kinds of subtle manipulations professors can use in the classroom. I'm just going to read it from her. She said, I chose to take this biology class because it dealt with technological advances in the field of biology and the ethical concerns which accompanied the advancements. Each topic was covered by a series of lectures and then allowed a discussion day with groups of students representing the pro and con side of the issue for the class, followed by a Q&A portion. After the presentation on embryonic stem cell research, I excitedly got in line to ask my question for the pro-embryonic stem cell research team. This was one of the first times I had the opportunity in college to speak up for the pro-life perspective. I had just returned from my first March for Life and was nervous to challenge the students in front of the class. They had made a case for the research on the basis that we should take advantage of the embryos instead of just letting them go to waste. Each student in front of me stepped up to ask a clarification question about something from either presentation, and a few challenged the con side. No one in my class had made any sort of pro-life case for any of the topics discussed. My turn came, and I began to ask the students if they would use the same argument they had presented to advocate for the intentional destruction of human life in other cases, if it would mean biological research could progress. I was about to give a thought experiment example when the professor cut me off. He hadn't done this with any of the students that day or in any other discussion days that semester. That question is invalid because this is not a case of human life. The embryo is not human. he said. So I'd like to say that I wasn't intimidated, but that would be a lie. My stomach dropped and my mouth went dry. There's a clear power imbalance in a situation like that between a student and her professor. No way was this a fair fight. I replied, What do you mean by that, Professor? That this is a biology class and we're discussing human embryos. If you're going to say I can't ask that question, then you're probably challenging my philosophy. Why do you think the embryos aren't human? He responded, you need to direct your questions at the other students, not at me. His response shocked me, and I felt like it was really unfair. I just wanted to go back to my seat and hide. I asked my original question I had written down to the team of students, got an answer I was very unsatisfied with, and went back to my seat. I'm angry just reading that story. Like the professor totally cut in to challenge Rachel, and then when she just asked a clarification question back, he was like, no, you can't talk to me. You've got to talk to them. It's more subtle than God's not dead, but this is what goes on all the time. In women's studies classes, in poli-sci classes, in philosophy classes, I hear the story a lot. So Rachel gave a good summary of what she experienced and what we're hearing from pro-life students across the country. So I just want to read this paragraph from her because I think this is a great summary. She said, the college campus is a hostile environment for diverse thought. Not only are pro-life students outnumbered in classes, but I've seen course material set up in a way which leads to a restricted discussion in the classroom. Assigned readings often exclude the pro-life perspective altogether, and so when students are asked to discuss the readings, they are comparing the works of pro-choice writers. How can a minority view be represented properly in a class like this? The pro-life student must reference an outside source that other students haven't read, or try to make claims from their own original thought, which doesn't hold the same weight as the established scholars they're up against. Diversity isn't an ultimate good in itself, but it seems like university administrations preach like it is. Diversity can be instrumentally good if it brings together people who think differently and allows for the innovation of new ideas. University departments and professors should work to incorporate different ideas so that students can be taught how to think. Instead, students are being taught what to think, especially when it comes to moral issues. I'll tell one other story a little bit later. What we want to do is we want to help equip your teens to deal with the toughest pro-choice philosophical arguments for when they get to campus. Or even if they don't go to college, help them when they get onto the real world, where people are making pro-choice arguments, who are coming from, they're not Christians, they're coming from an atheist worldview. How do we deal with that? And I feel like this is where we're going to have a lot of common ground. Of course, we should equip our students before they go out into the world. But I think what is possible to do is to spend a lot of time on Christian apologetics and kind of think abortion is the most obvious moral issue of our day. How can we not just know? All you need to know is about fetal development, and maybe if you choose to show even maybe some images of what abortion does to babies, and just be look, we know what Psalm 139 says, we know what Jeremiah 1:5 says, we know that second trimester John the Baptist kicked in his mother's womb in the presence of first trimester Jesus. What else do you need? And the problem is we get to the world and we start talking to pro-choice people and wanting to save lives. And to do that, we've got to find ways to talk to them that's going to help them and certainly be already equipped to deal with the toughest challenges that they're going to give so that we don't have students, kind of going out in the world and becoming more liberal. We all know what the stats are, what is going on after kids turn 18. We want to try to prevent that. And so I'm not an expert in Christian apologetics. I enjoy it, but that's not our expertise. I think we are the best at this, at understanding the most nuanced pro-choice arguments that professors are teaching and give really good responses to them. Better responses than sometimes that we've heard from other sources in the pro-life movement, and that's what we want to be able to equip your teens with. Or I want you to equip your teens with them. So if you decide, okay, I'm convinced, I'm going to go equip them on my own, I don't need ERI, fine, awesome, go equip them. I want to tell you about some of the things that would be good for you to talk about that would be easy to skip. Because a lot of times I think for pro-life people, even if they go from biblical arguments to kind of more philosophical arguments, the obvious area for us to talk to our students about is going to have to do with the moral status of the unborn. Is the unborn child, morally speaking, like you and me, like a person? Is it made in God's image or is it something different? Almost every pro-choice person believes it's not like you and me. It's less valuable. It's not a person. Maybe it's partly, maybe it's like kind of like a golden retriever. It's got some value, but it's not like you and me. It's not equal. We're trying to argue that the unborn should have equal rights. That's why we're called Equal Rights Institutes. We're making an equal rights argument for the unborn. I'm going to talk about that argument not today, but in my session tomorrow at 5. If you're interested in knowing the argument that so when we talk about R&D, I was going to kind of tease that session because I want you to come. When we talk about like trying new arguments and seeing what works and what doesn't, like sometimes we try things that we're like, this is going to be awesome. And then it's like, totally doesn't connect. Like it connects with us, but doesn't connect with them because we're culturally different. There's a big cultural gap. And so we've got to try to figure out what works for them. But of all the different things that we have tried that have worked, there is no more kind of extreme story than the equal rights argument. Because I spent most of my pro-life career teaching a certain way of responding to pro-choice people who say it's not a person. And then we heard this argument from Dr. J.P. Moreland at Biola, this brilliant philosophy professor, and we're like, that's kind of interesting. It's different. And so we started trying that on campuses all across the country, and I've never seen any other argument change more pro-life minds on the spot, more pro-choice minds on the spot. See more people come from pro-choice to pro-life right away. And most people don't change their minds on the spot. Most people need months or more, to like change their minds because their views about abortion connect with their views about all kinds of things, their views about sex and responsibility and parenting and all these other things going on. But I have seen a lot of people change their minds on the spot, and usually, almost always, it's because of this argument that we started teaching a few years ago because we've never found anything to work better. If you want to know about that, you should come to my talk tomorrow at 5. Here's a couple other things, though, that are less obvious that would be good for you to be talking about, though, with students. One would be bodily rights arguments. So for almost every pro-choice person I've talked to, especially in the last few years, they had sort of at least 2 simultaneous arguments or parts of their worldview that were foundational to them being pro-choice. One was it's not a person. It's not like you and me. But there's another thing going on at the same time, which is the view that even if I'm wrong about that, even if it is a person, she should still have the right to abort because it's in her body. Because there's a special relationship between the child and the mother's body, so that she should have the right to abort either way. Because if she doesn't have that right, it's a violation of her bodily autonomy. It would be too much of a violation of like bodily integrity or bodily autonomy if you take away the right to abort. The government shouldn't be restricting what people do with their bodies. And so even if pro-lifers convince them, even if the equal rights argument connects with them, sometimes it's like, hey, they still got this other thing going on. So I kind of think of it as like it's not usually one or the other. It's both at the same time. I think of it as their main thing going on is they don't think it's a person. But then they've got a bodily rights safety net underneath. It's like a hammock. So that if this collapses, they still have a reason to be pro-choice. And they feel very confident in this one because, admittedly, I don't think pro-life people have tended to be that persuasive in responding to bodily rights arguments. My friend Trent Horn, I don't know if any of you listen to Catholic Answers, but my friend Trent Horn, who's on Catholic Answers a lot, has talked about how there's 2 different kinds of bodily rights arguments. There's this kind of easy to respond to one, which he calls the sovereign zone argument, which is like she can do whatever she wants with anything inside of her body. Her body, her choice. If it's in her body, she can kill it. If it's outside of her body, she can't. This one is fairly easy to respond to with thought experiments that just show you can't do anything you want with anything inside of your body. And if that was true, here are some things about the world that would also be true that pro-choice people basically can't live with. That one's fairly easy to respond to. But you have to be talking about this with your students. But then there's a tougher argument, and this is the one that they hear on college campuses more. Trent calls it the right to refuse argument. And it's the idea that it's more nuanced. So a woman can't do anything she wants with anything inside of her body. That's too extreme of a view, basically. It's an extremist kind of view. But one of the things that she should be allowed to do is to not be forced to be hooked up to other people for life support. So there's a famous thought experiment, if any of you are kind of into philosophy, called the violinist argument that was actually written 2 years before Roe v. Wade came out by this really smart philosopher who kind of just argued, like, even if it's a person, if you're in a hospital bed hooked up to another person, you shouldn't be handcuffed to the bed. You should be allowed to unplug because it's too much of a violation of your bodily integrity. If we're going to force you to be hooked up to another person with a right to life for 9 months, you can't do that to people. It's a violation of them, and they should be at least legally allowed to unplug. Every Philosophy 101 course that we have inquired about across this country teaches that argument. And it's one step away from being the best pro-choice argument there is. There's a way they can modify it to make it even better, is how do you kind of parse these things out, and what are the responses to both of these ideas that not only are true responses again, but what are the ones that we've seen work the most often? What actually seems to be connecting with pro-choice students right now? So, again, even if you don't get our course, cool. But you've got to be talking about bodily rights arguments at some point before they go into college, because they will hear about it. And again, I really want to emphasize, it's not an anti-personhood argument. It has nothing. They are basically tabling personhood. I'll tell you a quick story. So I used to live in Fresno, California, and I heard there was this pro-life group coming to Fresno City College, really close to where I worked, and they were going to do an outreach. Totally different group from out of town. I like watching other groups do outreach. I like kind of seeing, what do other people do? What do their signs look like? What's their literature? What kinds of arguments are they making? What are their dialogue techniques and stuff like that? So I came just to watch for a few hours. I knew the leaders from back in the day, but I didn't know their younger volunteers. But they kind of called me and said, hey, we're going to be at Fresno City on this day. And I'm like, all right. So I came by around lunch just to spend a couple hours watching them work. Well, I showed up at lunch, because that's usually the busiest time on a campus outreach. This is when everyone leaves for lunch and everything. And it was weird. It was like there was no one there. I found their exhibit. They had these kind of graphic signs and things. And I found their thing, but there was no one around. It was like The Walking Dead, like that first episode in Atlanta where there's no one around. It's like, where's everyone? It's like the rapture happened? Like, what happened? And all they had was one of their student volunteers just hanging out in front of their exhibit, just looking for someone to talk to. Everyone, including the leaders, were in the cafeteria eating lunch, basically. And so I had grabbed McDonald's on my way. So I just sat kind of a little bit away. I didn't know the volunteer. So I just kind of sat away. It's I'll eat my lunch and kind of wait for something interesting to happen. Well, I sit down, and the kid sees me. He's like, I'm the only heartbeat within 100 yards of the place. So I'm fresh meat. So he walks up to me. He's like, hey, what do you think about abortion? And I don't know what happened. I wasn't intentional. I just blurted out, I'm pro-choice. I don't usually do this. I don't just go around messing with pro-lifers. It's just we've been doing, when we do seminars, we would role play a lot to help students understand what are pro-choice people really like. Not the straw man, stupid, things that you read on a lot of pro-life websites. But what is it really like to talk to pro-choice people? And so we've been doing this so much, I just blurted out, I'm pro-choice. And then now I've got to pick a persona and be consistent with it. And I'm like, what am I doing? And he's like, oh, what are you doing? Tell me more. What are you doing? And I'm like, oh, gosh. And so we just spent 2 years working on bodily rights arguments. Because the argument that I sort of vaguely referred to, the really, really tough one, the way they can modify that thing to make it better, we'd been trying to solve that problem for about 2 years. Me and some other people that are kind of philosophical and wanted to try to figure out what could we do there. It took us a few years. And so because I'd always been thinking about bodily rights arguments, I kind of decided to be a bodily rights person. I was I just think I'm pro-choice because a woman needs to have the right to abort because it's completely dependent on her body, and she shouldn't be forced to, kind of give life support to other people. And he looks at me and says, oh, you're saying it's not a person because it's dependent on her. But that's not a good reason to think that someone's not a person. I mean, there's all kinds of people that are dependent. And I said, no, that's not what I said. I said, it's completely dependent on her body, and so she shouldn't be forced to, she should have the right to refuse, basically, to give life support, even if it is a person. And he said, you said dependency again. You're saying it's not a person because it's dependent, but toddlers are totally dependent on their parents and blah, blah, blah. And I said, dude, I know a few things about pro-life arguments. I'm not saying that. I think it's a person. But I don't think we should force people to be hooked up to other people. I think that's too much of a violation of bodily autonomy. And at this point, he went mute. He had no idea what to do with me. And at this exact moment, the leaders that I knew walked out of the cafeteria and were like, Josh is here! And he looked all kind of confused, and I kind of held up my hand, and I was like, hi, I'm Josh, I'm pro-life, And he was like, what should I have said? And so I walked him away and kind of gave him a 20-minute lecture on bodily rights arguments. Here's the point. I had a really interesting biographical experience while that was happening, during those few minutes that we were talking. Because when in a seminar setting or whatever, if I'm pretending to be a pro-choice person to help train someone, I'm pretty good at like getting into those shoes, and kind of pro-life Josh sort of goes away, like way into the background, and I'm just like trying to be really consistent with a certain person, and so I had this experience of like, I've got really frustrated. When this kid strawmanned me the second time, I started getting ticked. Because I felt like I was being really clear with my argument. I wasn't saying it's not a person, or saying it's totally a bodily rights person. And most pro-choice people are not that clear. Like there's a reason, like an understandable reason why pro-life and pro-choice people a lot of times talk past each other, is pro-choice, especially their side, the rhetoric can be really vague. My body, my choice can mean at least 4 really different arguments. And so there's kind of an understandable, it's easy to, even if you're trying not to straw man, to accidentally kind of misunderstand someone's argument and have like a misfire. Totally get that. This is not what was going on. I was being crystal clear with my argument, and he was like vigorously straw manning me. And I was getting so internally I got angry like at this situation. And I was processing about that later that day as I kind of drove away from the college back to my office. And I just had this sinking, like my heart sank, and just like, how many times have I done that to pro-choice people? How many times have I accidentally misunderstood what they were trying to say and responded to maybe an easier argument to defeat than the one that they were giving? And it's like, I just felt this sense like I want to work really, really hard to never make anyone feel that way again. So the point is, like, bodily rights arguments are tably impersonate. This is why, like, the automatic pro-life response of, well, it's its own body, doesn't work. That's not what they're saying. It's a completely different thing. And so we wanted to help people with bodily rights arguments. One other area, before I conclude, and I'll be interested in taking your questions, but one of the areas that's going to be really important now is to be talking to your students about utilitarianism. Utilitarianism, for those of you, I feel like I'm probably preaching to the choir, so like most of you probably already know, but just in case you don't. Utilitarianism is roughly the moral worldview. It's an objective moral worldview, not at all like moral relativism. That's a subjective worldview. This is an objective one. And it basically says that whatever, like objectively morally good, it's objectively morally good if it does the most good for the most people. If it does a good job of at a net level, increasing pleasure and decreasing pain. That's utilitarianism, or kind of a simplistic, for the sake of today, a decent definition. I've been noticing something really interesting on campuses in the last 3 years that I predicted after talking to a really brilliant philosophy guy a long time ago. And he kind of like, we were talking about this interesting trend that we thought would probably happen, and I'm seeing it now, which is that moral relativism is dying a slow death. Moral relativism, the idea, and there's kind of there's an individual version of relativism and kind of a more society version. It's like the individual is like your classic, well, what's true for you is not necessarily true for me, like a moral level at least, and sometimes even at like a scientific level. So we hear that a lot. Then there's like the societal one that's a little bit, I wanted to say like less stupid, but like not a lot. But it's like you can't judge other societies. Like societies, might come up with their own moral, views, and you can't don't judge them, like that kind of thing. So I've talked to a lot of relativists, and it's one of the most frustrating experiences ever. Like you will rarely turn a relativist in one day. Like it gets so deeply sunk into them. But we do have ideas of what works with relativists most often, and that's part of the course. But I don't talk to as many relativists today as I did a couple of years ago on campuses. It's being replaced with utilitarianism, I think for a couple of reasons. One, it's embedded in so many TV shows and movies. Every time Jack Bauer ever tortured someone, it's for utilitarian reasons. It's if we know this guy knows where the suitcase nuke is or whatever, and we torture him, we might be able to save 1,000 lives. That's utilitarianism versus our view, what ought to be our view, the Christian worldview or the deontological worldview, that some things are just wrong no matter what the consequences are. The consequences should not be part of the reasoning. So you don't see relativism very often in movies and TV shows because it's so obviously false. That's another reason relativism is dying. It's just so self-contradictory. It's wrong on its face. It's one of the few views that basically all, including secular philosophers, have abandoned. It's mocked by philosophers. The smartest atheist philosophers are like trying to get all their students to not defend relativism anymore because it's so dumb. And a lot of times people can finally see that. They can finally see, okay, I would have a problem if you stole my car, kind of a thing. And then the other reason is subjective versus objective. I think utilitarianism makes more sense on its face Because there are some moral truths that are just obvious unless your intuitions are so made backward by like Philosophy 101 class. I talked to the Philosophy 101 kids that like have now been taught to like question everything that they've ever thought, and now it's like this thing will happen where, you know, a class will be going on, they'll be talking about something horrible that I won't name because there's kids in the room, but you can imagine like horrible things that are in the world, and then like the one student in the back will be like, well, how do we know that's wrong? And then the professor will be like, good job. You're really questioning your deep beliefs. They're teaching kids to be idiots, to be intelligent fools. There are very, very intelligent pro-choice philosophers who believe very foolish things. And we want to know how to respond to even the intelligent arguments, even though they're coming from a place where like they're abandoning intuition. They think intuition doesn't tell them anything at an evidential level, which is not my view. There's a combination thing going on. Utilitarianism says no, there are some things that are objectively wrong. So it makes more sense on its face. And lastly, I think utilitarianism makes a lot more sense to young students because it does sometimes get right answers, like a stopped clock does. It's not getting the right answers because it's the right moral worldview. It's like an equation that happens to get the right answer. The equation's wrong. The way it's trying to get the answer is wrong. So utilitarianism is sort of accidentally right sometimes, but not because it's a good worldview. But because it's right sometimes, and students hear about, like, here's a couple cases where utilitarianism totally gets the right answers. It's more convincing. We're like, relativism never gets the right answers on anything if you're really consistent as a relativist. And so I talk to a lot of utilitarians now. Like, a lot of times what's going on for them, one of the reasons they're pro-choice, or one of the reasons that we have a hard time convincing them of obvious moral truths, like it's wrong to kill toddlers. I'm talking to those students now. We'll ask enough questions to find out what's going on. It's not like they actually hate toddlers. They're a utilitarian who's just consistent. And they have to say this. They have to kind of bite this bullet, if you will. And so we talk about how to respond to this. I've got time. So here's how we respond to this a lot of times. I'll give you part of this. What we want to do is try to show utilitarians that utilitarianism sometimes gets wrong answers. If it gets wrong answers, it's a bad moral worldview. You can't trust it. So you shouldn't have it. So we'll just try to show them what are some cases. So there's kind of a famous thought experiment that's meant to go against utilitarianism. And so we'll talk about this. Like, I was talking about this with a guy. We were at Portland Community College a couple years ago on April 20th, on 4/20. I don't know how every pot day I am on a college campus, but that's what happened. We were there, and campus smelled interesting. It's Portland, and I talked to a lot of people who thought they're really philosophical. It's like, you're a utilitarian who's high. It's a whole different thing. But anyway, so I'm talking to this guy for like an hour about this, and he was like, dude, this is what we should think. And so what I told him, so I kind of like started with this thought experiment. It's not our thought. This is like I've heard this other places. But it's like, it seems like if utilitarianism is true, again, the idea that what's objectively morally good is what will give the most good to the most number of people, or at a net level, increase pleasure, decrease pain. He said, it seems like, we'll say like, you seem like a healthy person. Well, like actually tell him that. It's like, you seem like a healthy person. Seems like in theory, someone could kidnap you, harvest your organs, like kill you, harvest your organs and save 5 lives. People who will die without those organs. We could take your heart, we could take your kidneys, your lungs, we could do all these things and save 5 lives. Why under a utilitarian worldview would that actually be morally wrong? They'll be like, well, I wouldn't like that. It's like, I know you wouldn't like that, but that's not the point, like, obviously. But morally speaking, is it morally right or morally wrong under a utilitarian worldview? And a lot of times they'll kind of just bite that bullet, but there is a response. So Sam Harris is a very famous atheist philosopher. I think one of the most rhetorically effective atheist philosophers. Someone like I enjoy listening to a lot. He's got a response to this. I don't know if it's originally his, but the response he'll give is like, yeah, but you, like conservatives, you deontological people, you think that's a response, but it's not. Like, we all agree you shouldn't kidnap people for their organs. But here's why this doesn't defeat utilitarianism. Because it's not actually better. It's not actually more good for more people. Because if this was happening, then society would be in a panic. All of society would be like terrified of leaving their houses because they might get kidnapped for their organs. So, nice try, you Christians, but that's not going to do the job. Okay, well, I can defeat that by just modifying the thought experiment. All right, let's say this just rarely happens and no one knows. There's a small team of like SWAT guys led by Jack Bauer himself. And they go and just every once in a while kidnap homeless people who no one knows, kidnap them, kill them, harvest their organs. This happens like once a year. No one can find out. I don't know how the utilitarian can respond to this. And so what we're trying to show them is your worldview necessarily gets wrong answers sometimes. And as soon as we can show them that, we can be like, this shouldn't be your view. You should change the way you think about like everything now. Like this, like you don't have a trustworthy view. You've got a view that gets wrong answers. We teach all this in the course. But again, kind of my point is, regardless of whether you want us to kind of help you train your teams or you want to do it on your own, please do not neglect bodily autonomy arguments or utilitarian arguments, because this is where students are at right now. I don't know what else will be going on that we need to respond to in 5 years that are like at a big serious level. Like there's other things we deal with, like people who bite infanticide bullets and things like that. But like I don't know what's going to be going on in 5-10 years. We'll be talking about that on the course. But this is what we're learning about now. So what I want to do is let me just tell you one more quick story. Because sometimes when students are properly equipped, they can still deal and do an effective job even though they are kind of sometimes, you've got a college professor who's working against them. I just, a couple of weeks ago, got a story from a student named Ellen, who's one of our students. She took our course, and she just wanted us to know what happened. This is one of my favorite things that ever happens, so I get emailed a story from someone that we've been training. Here's something that happened for her. So she says, this spring I signed up for an honors philosophy course in ethics. I don't consider myself much of a philosophy nerd. I'm an art major. But I needed the general education and honors credits, and as a pro-life apologetics dork, I figured parts of it would be relevant to my interests. There were a few things that happened as we progressed through the course that made me realize that this would be more difficult to sit through than I'd anticipated. Her course, not our course. First, our textbook and the majority of our other readings were written by Peter Singer, who is pretty open about some opinions that are at best rather concerning. I don't know if you're familiar with Peter Singer, but he's the professor of bioethics at Princeton. I mean, he's one of 4 philosophy professors in the world that I know of right now who have basically said they think that it's morally right sometimes to kill infants. He's one of the few, but certainly the most famous or infamous, if you will, of them, but very respected in the world of secular ethics. Ellen says, second, our professor was pretty happy to hold up the stereotypical crazy lifer, in quotes, to make fun of, make some flip comments about how you'd have to be crazy to believe that a non-thinking collection of cells deserves moral consideration, and even told a story about how he was a huge jerk in college to a pro-life girl on campus. To be fair, she says he admitted to being a jerk, and the girl wasn't defending her position very well. But he still had some fun poking at the worst pro-life arguments instead of addressing some of the more well-thought-out points. I had initially been looking forward to trying out some of the dialogue tips and talking points I learned from Equal Rights Institute, but after a couple of weeks in class, I was seriously considering just keeping my head down. But wouldn't you know, I just couldn't keep my mouth shut. So he goes on to say, we waited until the next to last class before finals week to discuss the issue. The first thing my professor did was throw out a joke about how silly abortion stops a beating heart bumper stickers are, and gave some other examples of faulty pro-life arguments. I think this put me in a really great position to respond because I could first establish some credibility by critiquing a couple of bad pro-life arguments before going on to propose an alternative argument and critique the pro-choice view. I started by asking if he knew about ERI, and he responded somewhat, which I took to mean he'd heard of you guys, but maybe wasn't super familiar with the organization. I explained that ERI's goal was to basically help pro-life people, such as myself, make better philosophical arguments and be more consistent in their positions so that we can have better discussions. I don't usually bring you guys up by name in regular dialogues, but it felt appropriate considering the setting and audience, and I wanted to show that as a movement, we're actively working to get better in this area. I wasn't planning to go step by step through the equal rights argument like I normally do because I wasn't sure I was going to get the opportunity to present it properly. I started by moving the focus away from the unborn, which seems to be one of the major strengths of the equal rights argument. I said something to the effect of, it seems like the first question to ask is whether people, like human adults, are intrinsically valuable or instrumentally valuable. We spent a few minutes discussing what those terms mean. Before we could really come to a conclusion on that issue, class ended. But I felt better about how the dialogue would go during the next class meeting because I could tell I'd gotten him interested in the idea. Today, which was the last day of class, he opened the floor for discussion on the issue again, and I reminded him of where we'd left off and tried to narrate the debate to begin with because I was concerned that another student would get us off track when we started off so well. From there, I explained that because pro-lifers consider human life intrinsically valuable, we want to base rights or moral consideration on the kind of thing you are as opposed to what abilities you have, which would mean every human embryo would get moral consideration. He argued that the unborn in very early stages of life are not a rational kind of thing. When I made the argument that it's not the immediate ability to be, but rather being a member of a rational kind that gives you a right to moral consideration, he said he didn't agree with all the outcomes of that worldview, such as making even very early abortions and euthanasia wrong. So he doesn't counter her argument. He just says, well, I wouldn't agree with what that would mean. This is called ad hoc reasoning. He's working backwards. This is the wrong way to do reasoning. He knows the conclusion he wants to end up with, and he's working like, what premises do I need to work with to get there? Wrong way to do it. Start with premises and figure out what your conclusion ought to be from good reasoning. He's literally doing the opposite of that. I'll go back to what Ellen says. Almost done. So he says he didn't agree with all the outcomes of that worldview, such as making even very early abortions and euthanasia wrong, but he could see how it could explain things such as giving moral consideration to newborns when they aren't necessarily rational yet. About 5 minutes before class ended, another student brought up apparent hypocrisy in the pro-life movement, which I was able to address. And one thing I wasn't able to address was bodily rights arguments, which one student brought up at the very, very end of class. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough time to get into that, so I plan to write my final paper on it. Thanks for reading and thanks for what you do. I honestly think ERI is one of the best things to happen in the pro-life movement in a long time, and I hope I get the chance to meet you guys in person someday. I know that sounds pretty self-congratulatory, but that's what she said. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to questions, and I'm just going to give you a 2-minute ad for the course. I just want to explain to you what this resource is in case you want to use it. If you don't want to use it, fine. But we want to help the whole pro-life movement, or as many as we can get to. And so we can't just rely on who we can speak in front of in person. So we created a course last year. This is not a new thing, but we did what a lot of free smart people have done. So we wanted a systematic way of training the people that we can't get in front of, so we can help the entire pro-life movement hopefully to kind of get better and more effective at talking to pro-choice people, where we can save more lives and have the whole movement taken more seriously to a point where hopefully we can actually make it against the law, make abortion against the law. The videos themselves, kind of the systematic part of the course, it's about 4 hours of content if you binge it. And I have had people binge it. It's not what I would do, what I recommend, but we've had people buy it and they're done in 5 hours. But that's about 4 hours of content. What we do is we basically go through habits to avoid. The first module is all basically being more like Jesus, more like the kind of, I care more about the person, like the person that the pro-life student is to the pro-choice person than the arguments they make. I care about the arguments too, but if I have to choose between a very loving pro-lifer who's making faulty arguments versus a jerk who's making great arguments, I'll go with the first one every time. So we talk about some of the attitudes that we want pro-life people to have, so they're the kind of people that I think we basically ought to be. How do we be virtuous pro-life advocates, basically? Second module is on practical dialogue tips, just nitty-gritty body language, questions to ask, questions not to ask, how to listen well, finding genuine common ground when possible, just little things we can do to add clarity to the conversation, things like that. And then the rest is arguments. We talk about how to focus the debate on the issues that matter. We talk about defending the biological side of this, that the unborn is a living human organism. The equal rights argument, of course, responding to personhood stuff. We talk about how to respond to the issue of rape in a way that combines compassion and truth, which is a really hard road to walk, to do that well, to balance that well. We talk about bodily rights arguments. We talk about utilitarian arguments. That's all kind of the videos of the course. The value of the course gets better every couple of weeks because we release a long-form podcast, kind of a roundtable discussion where we're going deeper. I'll give you some examples of some of those topics. I love our podcast. It's my favorite part of this thing. I'm so proud of the things that we talk about. We're putting out a lot of new ideas and just practical. And this is how we answer questions. We get students asking questions. All right, what do I do when a person says this? That wasn't covered in the course, and we can talk about it on the podcast. We just keep on putting that out. So for everything on the website, access to everything on the website is $39 for a whole year, for everything, and your whole family gets it. We have a group membership level. You would only need that if you're leading a group of other homeschool families, because then what happens is it's less per person and everyone gets a login, so they can download the podcast, download the audio versions of the course if they're more of an audio learner. But if it's just your family, you don't need that. Just get the individual $39 thing, and if you get it from our booth at this conference, you get 25% off. That's the only place that I offer that is in an in-person kind of conference setting like this. We have a booth in the far back right side of the exhibit hall. That's where we are. If you want to come by and get it there, you can do that. But if you want to get it later, you can go to equipcourse.com. If you want to learn more about us, You don't need that because you already had the iPad, but those are some examples of our blog. We have about 150 articles on our blog. So if you're kind of like, I'm not ready to give these guys money yet, but I'm kind of interested in what other things they have to say, I love this stuff on our blog. I'd love you to check that out. Or you can follow us. We've got a public podcast, a free podcast, a shorter, Facebook, Twitter, whatever. Okay, advertisement over. I would love to take any questions that you have. We have about 8 minutes. Yeah, so that's a really good question. I have a very, and this is probably because of my background, I'm a very big parents' rights advocate. I think kids are different. I think that's for you to decide. So my 8-year-old knows what abortion is. He finally found out more about what I do. For the longest time, all they've known is that Daddy helps the basketball babies. That's what they call unborn babies, because when my wife gets pregnant, she goes way out this way. You can't tell from behind her she's pregnant, but just it looks like a basketball's under her shirt. So they call unborn children basketball babies. And that's kind of all we told them. Dad helps basketball babies, and it's all they need to know. Now at 8, I want him to know more. He knows what abortion is. He knows what I do. And we've decided that because it seemed age appropriate for him. He doesn't know everything. He hasn't had the talk yet and things like that, but he knows more now. So it's kind of this incremental thing that happens. So I think it depends on your kids. I think abortion is a sort of adult topic. There are natural questions that will lead from the abortion question. So it wasn't long after I learned about abortion that I got the talk, right? And that's pretty natural. So that would probably be part of your thinking on this. I certainly think as soon as they're ready to start learning about worldview stuff, it's a good time to get them going in it. And the nice thing about the course is they can listen or watch the videos as many times as they want. It's not like in a speech where they're they better get it the first time or whatever. They can really spend some time learning these things, getting the podcast, asking questions, and mastering the material. What the goal ought to be is absolutely they should have mastered the stuff before they're 18, before they go out there. I think that's probably on the later end of when I would start them, but I think that's completely what do you think would be helpful for your kid? When are you getting into more worldview stuff where you might already be talking? Some of you were already planning on talking about relativism and other things with your students. When would you start doing that? When are you ready for them to start confronting serious sin that's in their world? This is a pretty depressing topic. I don't think our training material is not very depressing. We try to be we don't want it to be just a bummer all the time. It's it's not like watching Schindler's List on a loop or something like that. But we want to be practical. We want to be helpful for them. Here's the one other thing to be considering. I think it also depends on how much influence the outside world has on them and how much interaction they have with people their age who are kind of in the world, if you will. There are high schoolers that think about abortion. The number one age demographic that has the most abortions is college students. But high school students is number 3. Because obviously it's a pretty big, scary thing when you're a teenager with an unplanned pregnancy. And that happens with Christians. In fact, there's a reason why a lot of Christians have abortions, even though they know that abortion's wrong. It's a much bigger deal in a lot of churches. So if you take anything from this, please have a youth group and a church that everyone knows if someone gets pregnant, we're going to love that kid. We're going to love that student. We're going to be there for them. There's not going to be a scarlet letter. We're not going to kick them out of the youth group because of we're terrified of what they're going to do. We're going to get around this person. We're going to help her choose life, because there are thousands of Christian teenagers that are having abortions who know they're killing a baby and are wrecked after it, but they do it because they're afraid of what happens if their parents find out. They're afraid of what happens if their youth pastor finds out, their youth group finds out. They're afraid of being judged and teased and all that stuff. And no one better than parents and youth pastors to prevent that. But that is a cultural revolution that has to happen across this country. I wasn't planning on talking about that, but anyway, I got going. Okay, so it's a really good question. Kind of depends on a lot of those different factors. But if my son or any of my sons has any friends, even Christians or atheists or whatever, in their teens and are close enough that they would find out about an unplanned pregnancy, might be a guy who got his girlfriend pregnant, they have a real chance of saving a life. Because a lot of times, peers talk to peers. Sadly, they don't talk to parents enough, but they're talking to their peers. So that would be something to consider. You had a question.
Just real quick, I guess.
Yeah.
I wanted to hear your thoughts about the sidewalk ministry.
Sidewalk counseling. So I think sidewalk counseling is awesome. Jacob is the other guy on staff, and he's manning our booth. You should talk to Jacob because he is one of the best pro-life dialogue people I've ever hung out with. He is so charming. He's from Atlanta. He's just a southern gentleman, charming guy. You can't not like him. So he connects with pro-choice people faster than I do, and I'm really good at this. Like, he is so charming. So you got to hang out with, just got to talk to him. But every Friday, he's still sidewalk counsel, which means he goes in front of an abortion clinic not far from his house and tries to convince girls not to have abortions on their day. And he's really good at it. The next module we're making to expand the course, we're never going to make multiple courses. Our plan is just to keep expanding this course. There's one course to rule them all, basically. And so the next module that we want to make is actually one that he's writing right now on sidewalk counseling tips. Because Jacob, being the person he is, we're always thinking of R&D and how to get better at this and not just be stuck in kind of a rut of what we've always done. He's been figuring out better techniques on sidewalk counseling, which is different than a philosophical discussion on the college campus. If they're like not pregnant, totally different things. So we're going to make a whole course on what he's learned in the last, years and years of saving babies literally in front of the abortion clinic. There are other things people do in front of clinics that I think can be really effective. I think 40 Days for Life. I love 40 Days for Life. David B. Wright, who started that, is one of my closest friends in the movement. I love that man dearly. If any of you are familiar with 40 Days for Life, love 40 Days for Life. I think 40 Days for Life people should be a little bit separate from the sidewalk counselor because the signs can look like a protest. So there's kind of some things that they can do to work together. My personal view is we shouldn't have graphic abortion signs on an abortion clinic sidewalk, just because of the effect that I've heard it has on a lot of women who are there on their abortion day. They're much more likely to stop and talk to the loving. So I don't want to say the people with the graphic signs aren't loving, but the one who's obvious visually at an optics level is obviously a kind of a welcoming, loving person. They're more likely to stop someone from having the abortion than someone who, there's people that will bring bullhorns. There are people that literally bring, angel of death costumes and just, pace with, a scythe thing. There's people that do this stuff. Women see that, and, it sort of chases them into the clinic. I know so many post-abortive women. I've heard several say, all they needed was someone out there. They were looking for an out, but just didn't have enough self kind of determination. They're so manipulated by maybe their boyfriend or their parents or whatever. They needed someone else to walk them out of this thing. And either there wasn't someone there or there was a scary looking person there and it chased them into the clinic. So I'm all about sidewalk ministry, but I think some ministry is better than or more effective than others. And the whole graphic image debate is one of the most controversial ones within the pro-life movement. We've got a lot of thoughts about that. We're sort of in the middle. We use graphic images in a brochure with consent only. I think some people need to see the pictures. They're evidence, they're true, but we don't force them on people because a lot of things, the downside of using graphic images goes away if we get their consent. They don't feel like we forced something on them. They don't feel violated. And they're not suddenly mad at us for showing them versus mad at what the pictures represent, which is irrational, but it's psychologically how people often are. And so I've got a lot of years of experience standing in front of 18-foot graphic signs. I've got a lot of experience doing outreach with no graphic signs. And what we're doing now, we've created our own brochure. So we can sometimes just use field development and sometimes use abortion images depending on the person we're talking to. These people are complicated. Our motto, and I'll end with this, every conversation is a series of difficult judgment calls amidst prayer without ceasing. Every conversation is a series of difficult judgment calls amidst prayer without ceasing. We would love to help your students learn more about that before they get to college. Thank you very much. God bless.